The Dan Yorke State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
Good evening and welcome to my State of Mind. I am Dan Yorke. The vice presidential debate last night, a central focus. How long will be a central focus? Probably not long. They never are. This year, though, the VP debate may have slightly more importance given everything that's going on. Joe Cammarano, our political scientist from Providence College, joins me as he does on a regular basis to review what we have seen and talk about the big picture. First, let's see what the network reported about last night's debate.
The coronavirus pandemic was center stage last night with plexiglass dividing Vice President Mike Pence and California Senator Kamala Harris.
The American people have witnessed what is the greatest failure of any presidential administration in the history of our country.
From the very first day, President Donald Trump has put the health of America first.
At their only debate, the candidates sparred over health care and the Trump administration's efforts to dismantle the Affordable Care Act.
If you have a pre-existing condition, heart disease, diabetes, breast cancer, they're coming for you.
Obamacare was a disaster. The American people remember it well.
Last night's debate was more cordial than the presidential one between President Trump and Joe Biden, though there was still plenty of jostling between the two candidates and the moderator.
Let me also say, the American people deserve, Susan, the American people deserve to know who repealed the Trump tax cuts.
Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking.
The most viral moment came when a fly landed on Pence's head and stayed there for 2 minutes as he discussed race in America.
Look, we don't have to choose between supporting law enforcement, improving public safety, and supporting our African-American neighbors.
Harris is the first woman of color to appear on a major party presidential ticket.
Joe Biden will be a president who brings our country together,
Senator Harris,
and recognizes the beauty in our diversity.
The second presidential debate is scheduled for 1 week from today.
And so after that summary, I go to my go-to guy at Providence College, Joe Cammarano, who heads up political science there. I don't know, Joe. I don't even know how we start these conversations, but why don't we do it in a practical way first? And that is to react to the debate itself last night, the vice presidential debate. Clearly a relief in terms of total tone. We can dig into the nuances of it. But I think most of America expected that at least to be more in line with what we've always kind of expected, right?
Yeah, I think we've elevated the debate this time to about a ninth grade level. And that's progress, unfortunately, but it is good. Presentation was an important part, and there was mostly civility. Unfortunately, we see that as a win.
What do you mean by that?
So even as recent as, 2000 election, the preparation for a debate, whether it was presidential or vice presidential, included all sorts of experts who had their own briefing books on 20 different areas. And so there was a massive pile of paper talking about the details of public policy. The preparation for this debate is essentially a one-page sort of talking point bullet rehearsal, saying, well, what are they likely to attack you on, and how do you reframe it? And so the focus is on sort of the framing, the way that people are going to think about what was being said, rather than the depth and substance that debates were intended to do. And so they're really still not useful, even if people are polite and even if they answer half the questions.
And I think I think you've got to, and I think you are, making that an equal opportunity analysis. I think both Kamala Harris and the vice president were in that mode, maybe for different reasons, but in that mode, right?
Yeah, I would say so. Harris had 3 or 4 or 5 points she felt she had to get across to frame the debate properly. Pence basically had the same kind of goal. And the reality is Kamala Harris and Mike Pence know more detail than they let on last night. And to try to sort of talk about issues in depth requires sort of a commitment to answer questions as asked. And I wish they would do that, and neither of them really did that much.
And you wonder if they were distracted or forgot, or, as you would suggest, just wanted to go to the framing. There were two episodes that really kind of stand out for me. One is the question about the Supreme Court and the packing of it. Kamala Harris did everything she could to deflect, even though she tried to say, "I want to get to the packing. Let's talk about the packing that you've done on the lower federal level than the Supreme Court," which leaves people wanting. They want an intellectually honest answer as to whether or not there's going to be an additional member 2, 3, 4 added to the Supreme Court, or an attempt to do so if you think you've got the wrong side. Mike Pence, in the same arena, completely ignored the pre-existing condition question, which is such an important thing at the Supreme Court.
Right. First, you have Harris could have said, well, here's the problem. The court has been packed already. And because the court has been packed already, this has to be on the table. Otherwise, we're going to have a system where the democratic mechanisms of government are held back by these people who have life-term tenure, and we have to create equilibrium for that. And that might require a discussion about adding people to the courts. Boom. What's wrong with that answer? It's a thoughtful answer. People would understand it, and it would give people a clear notion of where they're standing on that. And Pence should have been honest about the affordable health care. Yes, if we repeal Obamacare, we're going to have to find a way for pre-existing conditions to be required to be covered. That's going to require regulations of health insurance. And that's not something that we've figured out yet. That's really his best answer. But that's not an answer he wants people to hear.
And in part, the Republican plan there is I think comfortable. I think the congressional Republicans are somewhat comfortable with delegating those issues to the states, and for some reason it seems like they don't want to talk about that. I mean, that's been part of the philosophy of ripping down the whole Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare. So, yeah, it's gotten to the point where it seems like our politicians for the highest offices fear any level of intellectual honesty with the constituents.
I think that's right, in part because instead of trying to persuade voters by giving them information and argument to support your position, they manipulate. And they manipulate through framing it in a particular way to start with the conclusion and reason backwards. And that's not any good way for people to make good democratic choices, small d democratic choices.
Well, let's talk about Pence himself. I mean, he look, style points. Yeah, he wasn't Donald Trump, but he was disrespectful. He rolled the moderator who, and you know what, Susan did her best, I think, but she got lost in her role. And I've done enough of those to understand how sometimes you can get lost in the dual responsibility. Talking about Susan Page, the dual responsibility of timing, fairness, and content. It can be a difficult thing. And Kamala Harris, I thought, navigated the woman thing. I'm speaking. By the way, I will tell you.
The woman thing?
Huh?
The woman thing?
Well, I think women in politics have a very difficult challenge.
Okay, I get what you mean.
When it comes to battle, they're damned if they do and damned if they don't. Interestingly, I listened to this because I had a power outage that lasted through the first 20 minutes of the debate. I listened on the radio, and when she said, "I'm speaking," the radio was hard. The TV was okay because she was smiling. It's but in terms of their comportment for the most part, it becomes a much lesser part of the story, and that's a relief, correct?
Absolutely. You know, their comportment really should not be a topic of conversation. I know it is, but it is because of the way politicians communicate and the way they try to manipulate people, and people respond by focusing on comportment. You know, comportment should be irrelevant, except as it reveals fundamental character issues.
All right, when we come back with Joe Cammarano from Providence College, we'll ask, what is the relevance of this vice presidential debate, if at all, on My State of Mind. Stay with us. Providence College political scientist Joe Cammarano. Joe, the vice presidential debate last night in terms of the entire election means what? How much value does it have?
I would say next to zero. Vice presidential debates are inconsequential. They're part of the storyline, the ongoing drama of a soap opera, which is the way campaigns seem to run these days, but they don't really have any impact. Maybe this year a little more because we got two old guys who could keel over in their second or first term. But the reality is, I think both of them showed that they were more competent than the top of the ticket.
Well, notwithstanding the keel over concept, clearly with the president having COVID, and clearly with Joe Biden, and just the more, look, Joe Biden did just fine in terms of the stamina thing in the first debate, but everyone worries about this stuff. The viability of the vice presidential candidates to be president, I'm guessing a lot of viewers looked at it through that prism last night. Can I see this person as the president of the United States? And for the most part, I think the answer would probably be yes.
Yeah. To be honest with you, I think, Kamala Harris has more experience than Barack Obama did when he became president. Mike Pence has a lifelong of service in elective office. He's got more than Donald Trump. And so I think both of them are fine.
So we put that aside. I didn't get a chance to talk with you after the first debate. Your take?
It was not an easy thing to watch. And, it was almost exclusively President Trump, although, Biden kind of had his inappropriate moments too. It was pathetic. I think Chris Wallace, for whatever reason, did a horrible job. And he didn't have much to work with, so we can't blame him. I always say it's not the media, it's the candidates. I really, I don't think the media are to blame for these things. If the candidates behaved properly and provided the right information for us to make a choice, there wouldn't be any problem.
Well, look, I don't know. Again, I've done, I don't know how many, maybe 100 in my career, significant debate moderation exercises, and I will tell you, I've had some challenges. That's an impossible job.
Yeah, I agree. And I talked about ninth grade level last night. This was preschool with a couple of kids who don't want to be at preschool.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what's going to be really fascinating is, and we'll talk about this in our next segment. I guess we should talk about it now. The chances that we have a second debate between the presidential candidates, I think, are 50-50 at best with the COVID situation. But the debate commission's idea to put a mute switch in the hands of the moderator is the single dumbest idea I have ever heard. I think. I mean, it is impossible. Think about this. We just talked about Susan Page and the challenge she had last night, and any moderator would. In watching the time, thinking about time sharing fairness, trying to regulate content, and trying actually to get something done on behalf of the people in terms of learning something. Then add in the pressure and the guarantee that Donald Trump will blame you for a mic mute, which doesn't shut off his voice, only shuts off his amplification. That is a crazy idea.
A better idea was presented by someone I was listening to on a podcast, I believe. And her suggestion was behave the way a teacher would behave in the first grade. If you can't follow the rules that you agreed to, you're getting a timeout. So I'm just going to talk to this person until you behave. That would require, an audible of getting rid of these artificial and I think ridiculous 2-minute limit, which serves a great purpose of covering 84 things 1 inch deep. And that's not what we need. So, but I think that's a better choice. I think the mute button, it's just going to lead to more petulance.
Right.
Right.
Right. It's going to accelerate what it's designed to mitigate. And I don't know. It seems.
I personally think they should take the second and third debate and basically say, all right, one of you goes one day, one of you goes the other day. It's 2-on-1 or 3-on-1. We're going to ask you questions and we're not going to time the answer. We'll interrupt you if you think you're going too far.
Meaning separate them?
Yeah. Yeah, think about this as an opportunity for those people those 6 people in the country who still aren't paying attention and don't have the information they need. Think about how much information they could gather if it was just a conversation, like a long interview. Much better, much better. These debates have outgrown their usefulness.
Well, that's a shame. When we come back, we'll talk about the president's health and the impact on this race with political scientist Joe Cammarano. Stay with us. Back with Joe Cammarano, political scientist at Providence College. Impact of COVID. I mean, really, we talked in the last segment whether or not we think there will be a debate. You want to put a wager down, odds?
Once the basic treatment regimen is done, we don't know whether this is going to progress in him or not. We just don't know that because there's no data. We don't have any knowledge. And so it's positive, hopefully he's well enough to do it next week, but next week is probably the most dangerous period for him. So, I just think it would be silly to have it. Plus, I don't think it's very useful for the American people.
In terms of what candidates do to get ready for a debate, I mean, his whole team is down.
His whole team is down. The last group, Stephen Miller has deep policy knowledge, but Chris Christie and Rudy Giuliani, they're basically trying to figure out what strategy he's going to do to shake up Joe Biden and make him stutter. So I don't think the Trump team has much of a plan for deep knowledge anyway. I mean, he doesn't do the homework. And, so yeah, they're down, but Trump doesn't listen to anyone anyway, because I interviewed Chris Christie as part of a college event about a week ago. And he actually made it very clear that President Trump doesn't listen to advice.
Well, I mean, we don't even know if Chris Christie's okay. I mean, there's been very little report coming out of his own hospital stay.
Yeah, I'm deeply concerned. He's an asthmatic, and like me, he's overweight, and he's not quite my age. He's a year younger, or 2 years younger, and so he's got a lot of risk factors, and I hope he's well, but we don't know. He has a privacy interest that we need to respect in a way that we don't need to respect with the president.
And tell me why. And that's a great area for just a final minute or two discussion. What is the criteria for how much we are supposed to and deserve to know about the president's health?
Basically, the expectation is the president is going to be as transparent as necessary, particularly as a candidate for president, so that we understand how that person is going to be able to conduct their affairs if they get elected. And for presidents, we need to know whether he's, the steroids is making him more aggressive. That's a very important aspect to this. We're not getting any of it, and what we're getting is very selective, and that's actually manipulative. It's, providing certain information and then saying, oh no, he's protected on other information is a double standard that's not acceptable.
Yeah.
By the way, he's not the first president to do this. Presidents always do it. Eisenhower did it, Grover Cleveland did it, Woodrow Wilson did it, Lyndon Johnson did it, Richard Nixon did it.
Yeah.
Kennedy, and of course, Kennedy.
I think we have to remind ourselves that Donald Trump has not created a lot of the behaviors that he is criticized for. But he has created an atmosphere that we've never seen before. And sometimes the line is so blurred that you really have to think through it. Final thought.
Yeah, basically, we've created a presidency that is restrained only by the person who occupies the office. And we've seen that with Trump, that the presidency has potential for abuse. Most presidents have adhered to most norms. This one is adhering to very few, if any, norms.
Well, the people said they were tired of the norms.
Well, yeah, the norms get in the way. Sometimes you want to do something and a norm says, well, you shouldn't do it. Well, if you accept the norm, then you don't do it. And this president isn't used to that.
With his COVID response, having COVID, you couldn't write this, Joe.
Well, let's pull out and look at the bigger picture. It's getting cold. And if you look at the states in the middle of the country, they are in deep trouble. And the bad period for this virus is just starting. We need to listen to Anthony Fauci a little more. This is not going to be good. We better prepare for a Thanksgiving that isn't a normal Thanksgiving, and probably a Christmas too.
Yeah. Only have a few seconds. Are we close to predictions on this election, or are we going to wait?
We're going to wait because it's still close enough. Although all the trends are looking like the Republicans are in deep trouble, not just at the presidential level.
Yeah. All right. Joe Cammarano, PC political scientist. Thank you. Always important to check in with you. Final word, and we come back on My State of Mind. Still to be determined whether we have another presidential debate. If I was a betting man, I would take a pass on this race. If there is one, I would bet that it will be something. I can't give you any more than that because you can't write this thing. Have a great night. Thanks very much for tuning in. Don't forget weekdays 3 to 6 on WPRO as well. Good night.